Thank you. Now, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Good. Let me just get some water and I will get going. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to visit Bonn and speak with you today. As Professor Decker noted, I'm Canadian, so especially at this time of year, it's nice to be here in Bonn enjoying your warm weather. It's a nice break from what I usually experience at this time of year. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the various the ideas that I have been working through over the years. I've put the titles of the covers of some of the books I've written over the past few years up on the screen. I've been asked, how do I get time to write so many books? And the key I find is just to loosen quality control. If you forget about quality, production just soars. So that's the key. But the central question that I think about in these books is how to govern well. And I think another question might be, is it possible in some circumstances to govern well? These are the sorts of questions that I've been thinking about, and basically the reason I write so many books is because I'm trying to sort out the argument myself. I usually write a book that there's an expression that books are never finished, they're abandoned. I abandon one book and then I try again to sort out the answers to these two basic questions in the next book. So what I'd like to do today is to walk through some propositions that have been central to the work that I have been doing on governance over the years. And then I will also talk a bit about my new book, Superstates, which is available in fine bookstores on Friday, actually. You can order it in the Kindle version on Amazon right now. So let me just proceed with talking a bit about some of the themes that have pervaded my work. So what I want to show you right now is, this is an excerpt from a diary of a man named Louis Brownlow. And it was written, as you can see, on March 9th, 1936. And Louis Brownlow was, in 1936, probably the most important man in the field of public administration in the United States. He led the most important organizations in the scholarly and professional field in public administration, and he was a close advisor to President Roosevelt. And this excerpt from his diary on March 9th, 1936 is a record of an argument he's having with some of his colleagues. And the question is whether representatives of the American field of public administration should go to a conference in Berlin a few months later in 1936. It's noteworthy that March 9th is actually just 2 days after the occupation of the Rhineland. But even putting that aside, there was, of course, immense controversy about the activity of the Nazi regime by 1936. Many people arguing that the appropriate response was simply to disengage with German institutions. And Louis Brownlow basically made the argument, as you can see here, that we don't want to muddle our conversations about public administration with so-called political questions. And a view that, well, administration is one thing, politics is another, which was an unfortunate view. They did go to Germany, and to considerable embarrassment later on. But even today, even though the notion is that we're more sophisticated about politics and administration, even today there are many scholars in the field of public administration who argue that we should just leave the so-called politics out of it. And I am not one of those individuals. I have been arguing among my colleagues that in the field of public administration it is important for us to be forthright about our commitments. And over the last few weeks, I organized about 35 organizations in public administration, mostly in the US, but also abroad to endorse a statement. You see an excerpt of the statement here, to mark Human Rights Day, which was actually on Saturday. It's the anniversary of the signing of the approval of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the premise is, and this is a premise that I think is fundamental to my work, that it is very important for scholars in governance to be clear about their commitments, to be clear about the goals that they are trying to accomplish with their work. And that was one of the aims with the Human Rights Day statement. Another theme, and this is going to seem trite at the moment, I'm sure all of you will readily agree with this proposition. Another theme in my work is that states matter. And I mention that because, I may be showing my age, but it's not so long ago when the prevailing or fashionable view in the scholarly community was that states didn't matter, that they were artifacts of the past. And I've put on the screen some books that were making the argument that the state or the nation state was dead, it was obsolete. And clearly we now know, after the experience of the first 2 decades of this century, that states very much do matter, whether it's dealing with questions of internal security, combating terrorism, dealing with financial stability, dealing with pandemics. States matter a great deal. And I would expect, given the turbulence that we can easily foresee in coming decades, that states will continue to matter a great deal. And my one observation I would make about this proposition that was fashionable in the 90s, that states no longer mattered, the notion was that authority or sovereignty had been taken away from the states. I have argued in some of my books that was a misunderstanding of what was actually going on in the 90s. Authority wasn't being taken from states. Authority was being given up by leaders of states on a contingent basis. And this is a point that was made by Senator Bob Dole during free trade talks in the US in the 1990s, where he said the sovereignty issue is a red herring, it's a distraction. If something happens that requires us to reclaim our sovereignty, we will do that. And many leaders of states, I think, took the same view. It may have appeared that states were ceding authority, but as I say, the cession of authority was always, I think, contingent, and in many ways reversed in the decades of the early decades of the 21st century. There is an academic argument, and this is what the Americans might call inside baseball for scholars in the field of public administration, especially in the American field of public administration. It's the analog of the proposition that states matter. States should not be ignored. There is a tendency, and has been a tendency, in American public administration especially since the 1980s, to ignore the state as a unit or level of analysis. A great deal of emphasis instead on what I will call middle-level questions of governance about how we make organizations perform more efficiently, how we manage more efficiently, what the British call deliverology. An attention on these middle-level questions of program design and implementation, and a neglect of big questions about the organization of the state, about the role of the state, and about how the role of the state evolves over time. And in simple times, when the world isn't too challenging, there might be an argument that you can ignore the large questions and focus on the middle-level questions, but clearly we do not live in those simple times anymore. And I have been arguing with my scholarly colleagues that we need to renew our focus on these large questions about what the state is supposed to accomplish and how the architecture of the state should be designed such that it's capable of performing essential functions. And that's what I have called in my Strategies for Governing book the question of sort of macro-level questions of public administration. Another central point in my work, and I have sort of been evolving this particular argument over the years, is that there are no fixed formulas for governing. Now, there are others who have argued that there are, in fact, fixed formulas for governing. That is, there is a prescription or model for how to govern that can be applied in many different places. In the 1990s, there were institutions in Washington, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, that were propagating a view of how to govern well that was very much a sort of standard formula. A formula that said, well, you should limit the role of government, you should open your borders to trade, you should deregulate your economy. There was a sort of standard formula, the route to success. I believe it was President George W. Bush who called it the single formula, the single successful formula for governing well, or words to that effect. And of course, there were scholars like Francis Fukuyama who argued in the 1990s that we had reached the end of history. All of the other models of government had been tried and had failed, and there was only one model left, market-oriented liberal democracy. I don't take the view that there can ever be a single formula for governing well. Strategies for governing, as I call it, you might call it paradigms for governing or models on how to govern, in my view, vary from one country to another, and they also vary across time. Leaders in different times and places confront different sets of circumstances. They see a different set of hazards confronting their polity. They make different appraisals about the relative importance of the dangers facing their states. They reach different judgments about the most likely way of the most effective way of responding to those dangers. And they develop a distinctive way of governing that reflects their judgment about the hazards confronting them at that particular moment in time. And of course, circumstances change over time, so we would expect strategies for governing or paradigms to change over time. And we would also expect the architecture of government, the architecture of the state, to change over time as well, because in my view, the state apparatus is essentially an expression of strategy. I made the argument, I wrote a book called The Four Crises of American Democracy, which was published just around the time of the 2016 election. So, just full disclosure, President Donald Trump announced that he was going to run for president in the summer of 2016, August 2016, and I told my wife confidently that this was going to go nowhere, that every summer Americans looked for something to occupy themselves during the slow summer months, and this was just sort of the summer entertainment for 2016. It turns out I was a little wrong. I mention this just so you know this when you're listening to everything else I say today, that take it all with a grain of salt. I also called my book Four Crises of American Democracy. Of course, it was published shortly before the 2016 election, so probably it should have been called The Five Crises of American Democracy, given that President Trump won. But the argument I made in the book was that it's basically a story about changing understandings about how to govern one particular country, the United States. And this book was triggered by a substantial literature that began to be produced around 2014, arguing that American democracy was in serious trouble, that this was a sort of existential threat for the American system, a great deal of despair about the future of the country. And I made the observation in the book that this was not the first time that this had actually happened. And I'll show you as it happens. This is a quote from, well, this is an article written by James Reston. James Reston was a columnist for the New York Times in the 1970s. He was sort of like, if you follow Paul Krugman today, he was sort of like the Paul Krugman of his era. And this is a column that he wrote in 1975 about the crisis of democracy. And the interesting thing about this column is you could run it today and you probably wouldn't notice that it's 40, 45 years old. And the point I make, and incidentally, that picture on the top is Jimmy Carter in 1979 giving a speech in which he told the American public that the American democracy was in terrible trouble. It became known as the malaise speech. It turned out to be a politically inadvised thing to do, but and actually it was a time of gasoline shortages as well, so there's another parallel there. But I mention this just to make the point that that sort of sense of malaise and despair that had began to rise after 2014 was not new. There'd been a similar sort of democratic funk in the 1970s, also in the 1930s, also in the 1910s. And I made the observation, the argument in the book, that the United States went through these phases of hubris and despair. And the moments of hubris where leaders had thought they had got it all sorted out. In the United States, I would say the year 2000 was a moment of hubris where both Democrats and Republicans thought they had figured it all out. They had the single formula for governing well, market-oriented, globalized liberal democracy. That was the prescription for everyone. And that model, that paradigm, began to fall apart over following years, and it essentially collapsed, I think, by the 2016 election. But one of the things I argue is that the United States, and I would argue all countries, have to go through this process of changing their understandings about how to govern as circumstances change. And that process is slow and often painful. And at the nadir, at the bottom, you get these concerns about democratic malaise because there seems to be this sense of drift. Old ideas don't work anymore, but new ideas have yet to be found. A new consensus on how to govern hasn't emerged yet. And I would argue in the American context, that's roughly where we are today. We're in that period of paradigmatic or ideational collapse and reconstruction. And the observation I make is that this process of sort of turning in national strategy, of reaching a new understanding of how to govern, takes a long time. I won't belabor the point for the moment, but if you looked at those turning points I mentioned earlier on, 1910, 1930s, 1970s, the period of the length of time between the sort of wobbling of one paradigm and the consolidation of the next paradigm is usually about a 20-year period. So the ship turns very slowly is the premise. And I and a colleague, David Cohn from University College London, actually wrote a short piece in 2012 basically on that premise that we were in this period of paradigmatic reconfiguration. And we wrote this in the journal Governance, which coincidentally I was editing at the time, that basically made the observation that we should expect the financial crisis to mutate into a political and social crisis, distinguished by concerns about the dysfunctionality of political processes and the decay of public order, which I think is essentially what we have been experiencing over the last few years. If you buy that argument, then the proposition would be we would see the emergence of some kind of, in the United States in particular, the emergence of some new understanding of how to govern over the next, let's say, decade, and the consolidation of sort of a new conventional wisdom or consensus that this is how the country would be governed. So I've made the sort of broad argument that there's no one model for how to govern well that's portable between countries or over time. The parallel to that proposition, and again, this is sort of advice to my scholarly colleagues, is that we should resist the tendency toward scholarly homogenization. And that is the tendency to think that we as scholars, whatever country we're located in, are going to have the same preoccupations, be concerned with the same research questions. And I mention that because the very structure of our field, and this is true of other fields as well, is tending toward homogenization, just because of the way in which the field is trending. For a bundle of technological reasons, you see the emergence of the consolidation of a variety of different journals into one sort of list of ranked journals, a preoccupation with top-ranked journals, with getting into the pages of a top-ranked journals. And one of the side effects of this is sort of a homogenization of discourse, the pressure on scholars to study the same list of problems that get reprised in the top-ranked journals. And one of the arguments I would make is that that's dangerous because every country is going to have its own priority list of what it ought to be studying. Let me just talk a bit about the book that I've got coming out on Friday. It's called Superstates. And I'll just tell you a bit about the question that triggered the production of this book. And I make the observation that by the year 2050, about a quarter century from now, 40% of the world's population will live in just 4 places: the European Union, India, China, and the United States. You can see the figures on the board. You'll see that these will be very large places. The most populous will be India. According to the United Nations population projections, India will surpass China as the most populous country in the world sometime in the next few months. And it will go on to have 1.7 billion people. These are remarkably large polities. 1.7 billion is the population of the entire world only a century ago. About 500 million, the population of the EU or the United States, that's 400 million, 500 million. That's roughly the population of the British Empire at its peak a little more than a century ago. So these are very big places. If you take these 4 places and put them aside for the moment, there are about 160 other countries. And there is an order of magnitude difference between all of the other countries and these 4 polities. The modal or typical country in that group of 160 others is roughly the size of Portugal or New Zealand in terms of territory and population. So they are, relatively speaking, relatively small. And then you get these gargantuan polities. And the simple question is, what makes us think that it is possible to govern a polity with 1.7 billion people in it? What in the whole of human history gives us confidence that this is a feasible task? And just to push the point a little further, since we should have a commitment to democracy and human rights, what gives us confidence that it's possible to hold together polities this size while also honoring democracy and human rights? And I would just note parenthetically, to get to a point that I'm going to mention on the next slide, to the extent that we have knowledge about how to govern these supersized polities, one generally accepted proposition was that it was impossible to do it while respecting democracy and human rights, that authoritarian rule was the only way to keep these supersized polities together. So that is the question that sort of triggers this particular book. And I do a couple of things in the book. I basically say, we need to class these four polities together. We need to put them all in the same box. Very often in scholarship, you've got scholars who will specialize on the United States or the European Union or India or China. And very often they develop their own vocabulary to explain what's going on in each of these four places. But I argue that you should think of the leaders of these four polities as grappling with very similar problems, perhaps in very different ways. But we should do a compare and contrast between these four polities and try to break down the barriers between these four academic silos. And I also suggest that we should break down another barrier, and that is between past and present. A general theme in my work is that history matters. In scholarship, certainly in public administration, and I suspect also in political science, there is a very strong tendency toward presentism, by which I mean a tendency to look just at the present moment. To the extent that you look in the rearview mirror, you don't look very far back. I did a rough study of recent scholarship published in the United States in a leading journal a few years ago, and I tried to ask how far back did the articles appear to be going. In a sense, what was their historical consciousness? And the answer was about 25 years, was essentially how far back these articles were looking when they were attempting to explain political phenomena. And in the scheme of things, that's not really looking very far back at all. In this particular case, I make the observation that, rather oddly, even because we no longer live in a world of empires, the literature on the governance of empires is booming right now. It's a growth field. But it's being written largely by historians, and they're thinking about the governance of empires largely as a historical concern. How were empires governed? And so one of the arguments I make is that we should try to break down the barrier between the political science literature, looking at governance of these large polities today, and that historical literature on the governance of empires. And the proposition I make is that we can apply some of the lessons that we draw from that literature on empires to the governance of these supersized polities today. And I won't belabor all the points that I've got here, except to observe a couple of points. The literature on empires is pervaded by this notion that empires are fragile, or were fragile constructions. The line was, empires rise and fall, or empires always die, which is a way of saying these entities, these vast constructions, were inherently fragile. There's a tendency in the political science literature today to think of fragility as a pathology with regard to states. If you've got a state that's fragile, there's something wrong with it. A good state, an advanced state, is stable. And one of the observations I make about empires is that they could never achieve stability. They were always wrestling with fragility. And I will go on to make the argument that superstates have the same sort of predicament. In empires, leaders were often confronted by a range of hazards, whether it was war, rebellion, climate change, economic transformation, technological transformation, pandemic, and so on. And because of the sheer scale of these enterprises, the risk of getting hit by one hazard or another was larger than it might have been for smaller states. And there was also this difficulty, I argue in the book, that hazards would cascade, that one would trigger or aggravate another, that would trigger or aggravate another, and leaders were always attempting to avoid a cascade of hazards that could be potentially fatal to empire. To use the current vocabulary, polycrisis was a sort of recurrent problem of imperial governance. And imperial leaders were always trying to invent regime designs that would be effective in managing various hazards and avoiding the problem of a cascade of hazards. But life is complicated. No design ever worked perfectly. Every design had its own particular deficiencies or weaknesses. A regime designed to fix one hazard might compound another. So there's a large element of sort of juggling going on here, that imperial leaders were constantly redesigning their regimes to put off the day of collapse. There's a novelist, you'll have to excuse me, his name has slipped my mind at the moment, who made the observation that imperial leaders were always putting off the last day. And that was the sort of temperament of governance, I would argue. So I make the argument that empires are superstates, these very large polities I described earlier on, are somewhat like empires. Why? Because they're expansive, they're complex, they're unavoidably diverse in their population, very populous, of course, as well. And so they have these various problems of holding things together that the imperial leaders also confronted. One might ask, well, you know, is there any reason could we argue that superstates are actually more durable than empires? That, you know, empires were one thing, but empires were long ago. You know, you could imagine a story that says, well, you know, superstates, the leaders of these entities like India, China, the US, and the EU, they've got tools, mechanisms for governing that were never available to imperial leaders. New technologies of surveillance and monitoring and measurement and control that might actually mean that they can avoid all of these problems of fragility and the risk of collapse that imperial leaders were always dealing with. So I think, you know, if we're asking the question, are superstates more durable than empires? On one side of the balance sheet is the available of all of these new control technologies, but there's also, on the other side of a balance sheet, a whole bundle of reasons why superstates might actually be more fragile than empires were. And I won't run down the entire list, but I will flag a couple of points. First, we expect superstates to do a lot more work than empires were ever expected to do. A contemporary state has to maintain a more rigorous degree of order within its borders. It has to know what's going on inside of its borders. It needs to provide a broader range of services, health, education, other welfare services. It needs to govern more intensively. So the argument is superstates are, in a sense, hybrid forms. They're part empire, part modern state. They carry the burdens of empire, how do you hold things together, and they carry the burdens of modern statehood, how do you govern more intensively. And carrying these twin burdens, I argue, is particularly hard work. And then the other fact I would observe is that the population being governed in superstates is qualitatively different than the populations that were being governed in empires. Not only are the populations substantially larger than empires, many empires ever dealt with, but, you know, the population of most empires was almost entirely illiterate. The population of superstates is almost entirely literate and well-educated. People have smartphones. They have access to a whole bundle of technologies for interaction, for organization. They're more mobile. They've got different ideas about their entitlements. So for a whole bundle of reasons, the populations of superstates is, how might I put it, more active, more energetic. The social situation is is percolating more intensely. So there are a bundle of reasons, I argue, why superstates might actually be as fragile or maybe even more fragile than empires were. I'll just make a couple of observations before I wrap up. One observation I do make in the book is about a tendency towards centralization that was evident in empires, and I think evident in some superstates. Centralization might happen for a couple of different reasons. It might happen because of an authoritarian impulse, a sense on the leadership group that we need to exercise firm control in order to avoid hazards. There's a democratic pressure that operates in some superstates like the United States, where parties competing for national office naturally tend to expand the role of central government. There's also perhaps a technocratic impulse towards centralization, this notion that, some problems if we could just centralize it, we could get it all sorted out by sensible planning. One of the observations I make in the book is that there is a danger to centralization, multiple problems that we tend to discount. The problem of overloading decision makers at the center with too many complex problems, the danger that different parts of a large polity will disagree profoundly on how central authority should be exercised, the danger that large centralized bureaucracies will be unable to perform well, and I should probably add too the danger that decisions taken in a remote capital will be regarded as illegitimate. So for a whole bundle of reasons, I make some observations about how to rule a superstate very tentatively. The very first thing I say is that the key to successful governance of a supersized polity is to recognize fragility, to understand what line of work you are in. I'm sure EU leaders in Brussels recognize the fragility of the enterprise they are governing. In China, leaders worry about stability maintenance. In Delhi, leaders worry about what they call centrifugal tendencies in the Indian polity. The only polity that we might say was not fully aware of the fragility of their enterprise was the United States, where until recently leaders took things for granted. I should say historically, leaders in the United States did not take their union for granted. This is a relatively new phenomenon. And then in recent years, of course, we've learned that you can't take stability or unity for granted, even in the United States. American leaders are again becoming cognizant of fragility. But I also make some other observations about how to govern a supersized polity while respecting democracy and human rights. I make the observation that you have to be careful about centralizing functions. You have to be careful about the design of central institutions. Make sure that you're capable of managing sectional or regional or national differences. And you have to be careful about the way in which you talk about your polity. And in particular, you have to avoid the assumption that you are governing one nation, one people, one public. Because the nature of the enterprise, I would argue, is that you are always governing multiple publics and negotiating differences between those publics. I'll just make a couple of observations. I make the observation in the book, the Superstates book, that one of the hazards that very often killed empires was climate change. I won't go through the list, but I do note, I just pulled out some of the examples I note in the book of empires that collapsed because of the direct or indirect impact of climate change. And I mention this because obviously we are entering into an era of climate change. There's a very interesting book that was published, written by an author named Gaia Vince. It came out in August. It's called Nomad Century, and you might enjoy reading it. The front end, the author talks about the likely effects of global warming if we get to 3 degrees or 4 degrees of warming. And she includes this map. And the key point is that the yellow and brown areas are the areas that are most likely to be severely impacted. And the observation I would make is that the areas of severe impact include a substantial part of North India, substantial part of China, obviously Southern Europe and North Africa, and obviously Southern United States and Northern Mexico. So that is a caution for us. Even if I were not talking about climate change, I would have said all of these polities are inherently fragile. And the lesson I think we should draw from this chart is that there will be another severe effect undermining stability in all of these polities in coming decades. What does that imply? It means that if you live in one of these places, you're going to be obsessing about stability and cohesion for coming decades. If you don't live in one of these places, if you're one of the small countries that's around them, you're going to be dealing with the reality that all of your major great partners are wrestling with problems of internal cohesion and instability. And then just finally, I'll just note in passing, I won't belabor this, but I'm doing a short book right now about Canada. I've made the argument that states have to be adaptable. They have to learn how to adjust their strategy for governing, their paradigm, their understanding or conventional wisdom about what government should do and how it should do it. That has to be reinvented periodically. And the question is, well, how do states do that? In the heyday of neoliberalism, this question, I think, was never really asked because we had the notion that we had got the one perfect way to govern. It was, to use an old phrase, a machine that would go of itself in perpetuity. That's not the way the world works. States have to know how to reinvent themselves. And one of the questions I'm pursuing in this short book I'm doing about Canada right now is basically what qualities are necessary in a state in order to preserve adaptability. You know, there's one model, the technocratic authoritarian model, which is you centralize authority, you get technocrats at the top looking down the road to see what dangers are coming, and then using state authority to mobilize resources to respond to those anticipated dangers. But none of us want to live in an authoritarian regime. We want to live in a regime that respects the principles of liberal democracy and decentralization of power. But then the question is how, in a polity where authority is decentralized and diffused and shared among many different players, how do you ensure attention to coming risks, and how do you coordinate response in anticipation of those risks? So that's the thing I'm working on right now. Let me just sum up with, this is the last slide, by sort of articulating what I think is my overall approach to thinking about statecraft, the problem of governing states, and I've already touched on many of these themes. I call it the realist approach. I think I'll just make the last point first. Sometimes when people talk about realism, they think it's unprincipled. My realism is principled. You know, it's driven by a notion that we want to build a world in which we respect human rights. But it is also a view of the world that recognizes that the world's a turbulent and often dangerous place, that leaders are constantly reinventing strategies for governing to address various kinds of dangers, that governing well involves recognizing the need for constant vigilance, a certain degree of nimbleness and flexibility in knowing how to govern, recognizing, above all, that fragility is the norm and that we constantly have to be adaptable. And I would argue, too, that there is a need, when thinking about governance, to take a very long view. And I would say that looking forward and looking backward. Looking forward, we need to do a better job of looking down the road to think about what risks might confront our homes. You know, there is a tendency in democratic politics to focus on the short term. One of my Canadian colleagues says the phrase is the medium term, 3 to 5 years. Well, I think we need to obviously look much further down the road than that, but electoral pressures often push toward the so-called medium term. But I also argue we need to take a very long look in the rearview mirror and learn much more from history about how to govern in a turbulent and often dangerous world. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.